The maximum CPP at 65 is $1,507 a month, but the average retiree actually gets $925. That's a $582 gap every single month, and it's not because you didn't work hard enough. The difference between taking CPP at 60 versus waiting until 70 could be $1,176 more per month. Over a long retirement, that gap can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most people choose their start age without knowing the full picture. Here's what makes this harder. If you had years off work, raising kids, a layoff, moving to Canada later in life, there's a good chance your CPP estimate looks worse than it should. But the government has provisions built into the system that can erase those low earning years from your calculation. Most people have never heard of them. I used to think that if you had a few years away from work, your CPP was just permanently lower. Turns out that's not true, and it took me digging into the actual government rules to understand why. In this video, I'll walk you through the real numbers at 60, 65, and 70. Then I'll show you the dropout provisions that can add hundreds of dollars a month to your CPP, even if your work history has gaps. If you're a Canadian in your 50s or 60s trying to figure out whether your CPP will actually be enough, hit subscribe. We're going to close the gap between what you're expecting and what you're actually going to get. Let's start with the actual 2026 numbers. At 65, the maximum CPP retirement pension is $1,507.65 a month. The average new beneficiary gets $925.35. At 60, the maximum drops to $964.90. At 70, it rises to $2,140.86. That's a spread of over $1,176 a month between the 60 and 70 figures, and that difference holds for the rest of your life. The mechanism behind this is straightforward. CPP is reduced by 0.6% for every month you take it before 65. That works out to 7.2% per year, or 36% less if you start at exactly 60. After 65, the opposite happens. It increases by 0.7% per month, or 8.4% per year, which adds up to 42% more at 70 compared to 65. But the start age is only part of the story. Your actual payout also depends on how much you contributed over your working life. CPP averages your earnings across your entire contributory period and compares them against the year's maximum pensionable earnings, $74,600 in 2026. The maximum benefit only goes to people who contributed at or above that ceiling for roughly 39 years. If you've had years of part-time work, raising kids, or a layoff in your 50s, that's not a personal failure. That's how the system works. The average benefit is $925 because most Canadians have some gaps in their contribution record, and most of them have no idea that those gaps can be fixed. So the question isn't just when to take CPP. It's also why the average payout lands so far below the maximum, and whether there's anything you can do about it. CPP calculates your pension by averaging your earnings across your entire contributory period, typically from age 18 to the month you start collecting. To get the maximum, you need close to 39 years of contributions at or near the earnings ceiling. That ceiling in 2026 is $74,600 a year. Most Canadians don't hit that. Years of part-time work, school, caregiving, illness, or a job loss in your 50s all pull your average down, and the lower your average earnings, the lower your CPP, no matter when you start collecting. Here's where it gets important. The government built 2 dropout provisions into the formula specifically to address this. The general dropout allows up to 17% of your lowest earning years to be excluded from the base calculation. That works out to roughly 8 years that get erased from your average. If you had a stretch of low income in your 20s, a gap in your 40s, or a tough few years near the end of your career, those years may not have to count. The child-rearing dropout goes further. If you had a child under the age of 7 and your earnings dropped during that time, those years can be removed entirely from the formula. Take Linda, who's 58. She left the workforce for 6 years in the 1990s to raise 2 young kids. When she logged into her My Service Canada account, her CPP estimate showed $380 a month at 65. After applying the child-rearing dropout, that number jumped to $680, an extra $300 a month, for life, from a rule she didn't know existed. Specifically, if you took 5 years off to raise a child when you were earning far below the ceiling, those years can be erased from the CPP formula. I've seen people's eyes go wide when they run the numbers. But here's the part that surprised me. The dropout provisions don't just apply to parents. The general dropout can help anyone who had a layoff, a rough patch, or a period of low income at any point in their career. Now, let's look at what the dropout provisions actually do to your number. Imagine someone who contributed for 25 years at an average income of $50,000, then had 8 years of near zero earnings, a career change, a layoff, caregiving responsibilities. Without the dropout, the CPP formula averages all 33 years together, 25 years at $50,000, 8 years at zero. That average comes out to about $37,878 a year, which translates to roughly $700 a month. With the general dropout applied, those 8 low years are erased. Now the formula only looks at the 25 good years, and the average goes back up to $50,000. The resulting CPP is closer to $925 a month. That's a difference of $225 every month, for life, from a rule built into the system that most people don't know about. I'll be honest, I used to assume that if you took time off for kids or went through a rough patch, your CPP was permanently lower. It wasn't until I went through the government's own documentation that I understood the child-rearing dropout can erase those years entirely. Here's how to apply this to your situation. First, log into your My Service Canada account and pull up your statement of contributions. Look through it and identify any years where your earnings were low or zero. Second, check whether any of those years overlap with having a child under 7. If so, the child-rearing dropout likely applies. If not, the general dropout may still cover up to 8 of those years. Third, when you apply for CPP, these provisions are applied automatically, but you need to understand they exist so you can plan around them before you apply. The dropout provisions don't require you to file a special form or hire a professional. They're part of the standard calculation. The only thing required is knowing they're there. Now, the dropout provisions can raise your base amount, but how much you actually get still depends on when you start collecting, and that's where the health question comes in. Once you know your base amount, the next decision is timing, and this is where a lot of people get it wrong, not because they're careless, but because they're only looking at one side of the math. Today's 65-year-old Canadian can expect to live to about 87 on average. Half of us will live longer than that. Here's the break-even. If you're eligible for the maximum and you defer from 65 to 70, you give up 60 months of payments. At $1,507.65 a month, that's about $90,459 in total CPP you walk away from during those 5 years. In exchange, you get an extra $633 per month starting at 70. To break even, you need to live to roughly age 82. Every year past 82, deferral is the better outcome. If you take CPP at 60 instead of 65, the math flips. You collect earlier, but at 36% less forever. If you live well into your 80s or 90s, those early years of smaller payments cost you significantly over the long run. Neither choice is automatically right. The question is how long you expect to live and whether you have other income to draw from in the meantime. If you have a serious health condition, starting earlier often makes practical sense. You get money in your hands when you can use it. If you're healthy, your family tends to live long, and you have some savings or pension to bridge the gap. Deferring to 70 is essentially buying a guaranteed, inflation-protected income for the back half of your retirement with no market risk attached. But what if you want to defer but don't have enough savings to cover the gap from 65 to 70? That's where a partial strategy comes in, and it's one that most people and a lot of advisors overlook. Even when the math points toward deferring, a lot of people still take CPP early. And I don't think that's irrational. I think it's human. The fear of dying before you collect much is real. There's a name for the underlying bias: loss aversion. We feel the pain of a potential loss more sharply than we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Taking CPP at 60 feels like locking something in. Waiting until 70 feels like gambling on your own survival. I've seen perfectly rational people take CPP at 60 because they couldn't stand the thought of being the person who dies at 69 and never got a fair return. That's not a bad reason, it's an honest one, but there's a different way to frame deferring CPP that tends to land better. Instead of thinking of it as delayed gratification, think of it as purchasing a guaranteed, inflation-indexed income stream for the rest of your life. You're not betting that you'll live long. You're buying protection against the financial risk of living long, which, for most Canadians, is the more likely scenario. If your health is good, your family tends to live into their late 80s, and you have some income to bridge the gap. The math favors waiting, not forever, but past 65. And here's something most people don't know. If you start CPP and then regret the timing within the first 6 months, you can actually cancel your application, repay what you received, and restart later, once. It's a safety valve built into the system that very few Canadians use. So what do you actually do with all of this? Step 1, log into your My Service Canada account and pull up your CPP statement of contributions. You want to see your full contribution history, year by year, and you want to get the estimates at 60, 65, and 70. Most people have only ever seen the 65 estimate, if they've looked at all. Step 2, scan that statement for years with low or zero earnings. If any of those years overlap with having a child under the age of 7, the child-rearing dropout likely applies. If the low-earning years came from a layoff, illness, or just a period when your income was down, the general dropout may cover up to 8 of those years. You don't need to file a separate application for either provision. They're applied automatically when you claim your CPP. But you need to understand they exist before you plan. Step 3, run the break-even with your own health situation in mind. If you have a chronic condition or family history of early death, starting CPP sooner is often the practical choice. If you're active and healthy at 65 and have other income to live on, consider what deferring to 70 would actually look like in dollars. And here's the move that most people don't know. If you've already started CPP but haven't been receiving it for more than 6 months, you can withdraw your application, repay what you've collected, and restart later. You can only do this once. So if you're feeling uncertain, don't rush the decision. One more piece. If you keep working after 65 while collecting CPP, your contributions continue to build a post-retirement benefit. In 2026, the maximum annual post-retirement benefit is about $54.69 a month. It's not huge, but it adds up over time if you're still active in the workforce. Here's what this video actually showed you. The average CPP at 65 is $925 a month, not $1,507. That gap exists because most Canadians have years in their contribution record that pull down their average, and most of them don't know those years can be removed from the formula. The difference between taking CPP at 60 and deferring to 70 is $1,176 a month. That's not a rounding error. That's a real, permanent difference in your income for the rest of your life. And the break even for deferring from 65 to 70 is roughly age 82. Today's average 65-year-old Canadian lives to 87. The math is not abstract, it applies to most of us. But the right answer for you depends on your health, your other income, and whether you've applied the dropout provisions to get your base amount as high as it can go before you decide anything. Start with your My Service Canada account. Get your real numbers. Check your contribution history. Then make the timing decision. If you want to keep getting this kind of information, the actual rules, the real numbers, and how to use the system the way it was designed, subscribe to Brian's Canadian Retirement Playbook. There's a lot more to cover.